He woke up to the same quiet apartment he had been living in for the past few months. The sun poured through the blinds, painting lines of light across the empty living room, but it did little to lift the heaviness he felt in his chest. He had learned to move silently, as if the stillness around him could shield him from the questions he refused to ask himself. The walls, once full of warmth and memories, now felt like a cage, echoing the emptiness that had settled into his life. For years he had thought he knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. Every morning had a plan, every day had a purpose, and every night ended with a sense of accomplishment. But now it all seemed like a distant memory, something belonging to another person. He had lost his job 6 months ago, and since then everything felt uncertain. The routines he had depended on vanished, leaving a hollow space that he struggled to fill. Each day seemed heavier than the last, and the effort to get out of bed felt like climbing a mountain with no summit in sight. He remembered the moment it had all started to slip away. It wasn't a dramatic event, nothing explosive or catastrophic. It was quiet, subtle, like a crack forming in a windshield that slowly spreads until it becomes impossible to ignore. A casual conversation at work had left him feeling exposed. A project he had worked tirelessly on was handed to someone else, and praise that once fueled his confidence was replaced with silence. At first he told himself it was temporary. He could catch up, prove himself again, and regain his place. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the silence never ended. The encouragement never returned. The world he had built for himself felt fragile, and he didn't know how to rebuild it. He tried to keep himself busy. He filled his days with errands, scrolling through social media, small tasks that required minimal effort but gave him a sense of movement. Friends called occasionally, asking if he wanted to meet up or go somewhere, but he often said no. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to explain the weight he carried. He didn't even want to admit to himself how lost he felt. It was easier to smile over the phone, to nod along in conversation, and then retreat back to his quiet apartment where no one could see how unsteady he felt. Some nights, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if he would ever feel like himself again. He thought about what his life had become and the person he used to be. The man who once woke up excited for a challenge, who could light up a room with his ideas and energy, seemed gone. He wondered if he had lost that part of himself forever. The loneliness wasn't just about being alone. It was about feeling invisible, like he had become irrelevant to the world around him. It was a strange kind of pain. Not sharp and sudden, but constant. A dull ache that followed him through every thought, every action, every breath. Yet, even in the quiet despair, there were moments he remembered that reminded him of who he could still be. Walking past the park on his way home one evening, he saw children playing and laughing, their joy simple and unpretentious. For a brief moment he remembered the boy he had been, the one who loved helping, who found satisfaction in little victories, who believed that effort could change something. That memory felt like a flicker of light in a dark room, small but persistent, reminding him that maybe he wasn't completely lost. He had people in his life who cared, but even that knowledge didn't make the emptiness lighter. Family reached out, but he felt guilty asking for help. Friends invited him out, but he worried they would see right through him, would notice that he was not the same person they once knew. He wanted to hide, to retreat, and yet, paradoxically, he craved connection. He longed to feel useful again, to feel that his presence mattered in some way. That longing, quiet and almost imperceptible, had started to stir something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope, however, came with fear. He feared failure, feared rejection, feared the vulnerability that came with opening himself to the world again. The last time he had tried to step forward, it had backfired. He had put himself out there, only to be overlooked and dismissed. Now the idea of trying again felt almost impossible. Yet deep down he knew he couldn't stay in this state forever. Something had to change, even if he didn't know what that change would look like. One morning, as he stood by the window sipping his coffee, he noticed an elderly neighbor struggling with a heavy bag of groceries. He could see the effort in the woman's hands, the strain in her posture. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and went outside. "Let me help you with that," he said. The woman looked surprised but smiled warmly. "Thank you, that's very kind of you," she replied. In that simple act, something shifted inside him. The weight of her bag didn't compare to the weight that began to lift from his heart. For the first time in months, he felt useful, even in the smallest way. It wasn't a permanent solution, and he knew it wouldn't erase the months of uncertainty and doubt. But it was a start. It reminded him that purpose wasn't always about grand achievements or recognition. Sometimes it was about noticing someone else's struggle and choosing to act even in a small way. The realization was subtle, but it lingered, planting a seed that would grow if he allowed it. As the days passed, he found himself paying more attention to the world around him. He noticed the barista at the coffee shop struggling to keep up with the morning rush. He offered a word of encouragement to a passerby who looked tired and defeated. He checked in on his neighbor more frequently, helping with errands or simply sharing a conversation that made her day brighter. Each interaction, though minor, reminded him that he still had something to give, that he still mattered. Slowly, his apartment, once a place of isolation, became a place of reflection rather than despair. He started keeping a small notebook, jotting down moments of connection, brief reflections on the day, and even small victories. Some days were harder than others, and he would fall back into old patterns of self-doubt, but the notebook became a reminder that he was moving, however slowly, towards something better. The act of writing, of acknowledging his own effort, gave him a sense of control over the part of his life that had felt lost. One evening, as he sat by the window watching the sunset, he realized that the emptiness hadn't disappeared entirely. It still lingered, like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. But now he understood that shadows weren't permanent. They shifted with the light. And in those moments of action, of helping and connecting, he had found sparks of that light. They were small sparks, fragile in the vastness of his uncertainty, but they were enough to remind him that he hadn't lost everything. He didn't yet know what the next step would be or where it would lead. The future was still unclear, filled with questions and possibilities he couldn't yet see. But for the first time in months, he felt a subtle determination, a quiet readiness to explore what was possible. He understood that rediscovering his purpose wouldn't happen overnight, that it would require patience, courage, and continued effort. Yet even in the midst of fear and doubt, he felt a stirring of hope, fragile but persistent, whispering that he could find his way again. And so, he began to move forward, not with grand gestures or bold plans, but with small acts of attention, care, and service. Each day became a chance to reconnect with the person he once knew, the person capable of making a difference, even in tiny ways. The journey was only beginning, but for the first time in a long while he felt the faint, steady heartbeat of purpose returning to his life. The small acts of kindness he had begun offering didn't go unnoticed. The neighbor he had helped with her groceries smiled whenever she saw him, and even the barista at the coffee shop greeted him with a brighter expression than before. These tiny moments of recognition made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in months. But life, as he was beginning to realize, had a way of testing sincerity. One morning he received a call that would shake him and challenge the very resolve he had begun to nurture. A local community center, known for helping struggling families, had been damaged in a sudden storm. Trees had fallen, windows were broken, and several areas were flooded. Volunteers were needed immediately to help clean, repair, and organize supplies. Many people had already stepped forward, but the center was so overwhelmed that they were calling anyone who could help. Without thinking too hard, he found himself agreeing to go. It was one of those impulsive decisions, the kind that felt right before he even had time to question it. The next day, he arrived at the center. The scene was chaotic. Broken branches were scattered across the parking lot. Water seeped into corners of rooms, and volunteers hustled back and forth carrying boxes, mops, and cleaning supplies. For a moment, he felt the familiar weight of doubt creeping in. He wondered if he could actually be of help. He wondered if he would only slow people down, become a burden instead of a support. He took a deep breath and reminded himself of the small victories that had brought him here. Every step he had taken over the past weeks had been preparation for this moment, even if he didn't realize it at the time. He started by helping clear the front entrance, picking up branches and carrying them to a pile. It was simple work, but it required focus and persistence. He noticed a few volunteers glancing his way, but instead of judgment, their faces carried an unspoken acknowledgement. Here was someone who had chosen to show up, who had decided to act rather than retreat. That alone made him feel a quiet sense of pride. As the day went on, he was assigned to help organize donated supplies in the back room. Boxes of clothes, blankets, canned food, and hygiene items were stacked haphazardly, and it was clear that without order, distribution would be impossible. He rolled up his sleeves and began sorting, labeling, and arranging the items in neat rows. Each box he moved, each label he applied, became a small act of purpose. He realized that even without fame or recognition, his work mattered. Families relying on the center would benefit from this organization. Children would have warm clothes, mothers would have food to feed their children, and the community would find a small sense of stability in the chaos. During a short break, he stepped outside to catch his breath. The sun was high and sweat dripped down his face, but for the first time in a long time, the exhaustion felt meaningful rather than crushing. He watched other volunteers talking, laughing, and sharing moments of connection. He overheard conversations about struggles and challenges, and something inside him stirred. These were people who had stepped up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And here he was, a man who had spent months hiding from life, now part of something bigger than himself. By mid-afternoon, a young volunteer approached him. She seemed overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work, carrying boxes that were too heavy for her to manage alone. Without hesitation, he offered to take some of the load. Together they moved the boxes across the room, laughing nervously when one slipped slightly and they had to catch it before it fell. In that moment, he realized how much joy could be found in shared effort. It wasn't about recognition or reward, it was about connection. The laughter, the teamwork, the simple satisfaction of making progress. It reminded him of experiences he had long forgotten, of a sense of purpose that didn't come from achievement but from contribution. The day wore on, and the work became harder. Mud and water made the floor slippery, and the weight of boxes left his muscles aching, yet he pressed forward, driven by a quiet determination. Each task completed felt like a small victory against the doubts that had haunted him for months. At one point, he found himself repairing a broken window with a few tools and guidance from another volunteer. He wasn't an expert, but the act of learning on the spot, of putting his hands to work for a tangible result, was exhilarating. The window was far from perfect, but it held, and that was enough. He realized that he had been avoiding challenges for fear of imperfection, and here imperfection was not only allowed, it was valuable. As the evening approached, the center began to look more like its usual self. The floodwaters were mopped up, supplies were neatly stacked, and damaged areas had temporary repairs. He stood back for a moment, taking in the transformed space. It was far from finished, but the difference was clear. Families would be able to access help, volunteers could operate more efficiently, and the community had a space where they could feel supported once again. A few volunteers gathered outside to share a quick meal and talk about the day. He joined them, still tired but carrying a sense of fulfillment that was foreign yet comforting. Stories were exchanged about why each person had come, the struggles they had faced, and the reasons they chose to help. When it was his turn, he hesitated. Speaking about himself had always been difficult, especially now when he wasn't sure what to say, but he found himself saying quietly, "I just wanted to help. I've been feeling a little lost lately, and I thought maybe this could help me feel useful again." No one laughed or judged him. Instead, they nodded, some offering words of encouragement, others sharing similar experiences. One older volunteer placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Sometimes helping others is the best way to find ourselves." That simple statement resonated deeply. For months he had been searching for purpose in isolation, trying to push through despair alone. Here, among strangers united by a common goal, he had found a sense of direction he hadn't known he needed. That night, as he walked home, every step felt lighter than it had in months. The aches in his body were real, but they were a reminder of effort, of contribution, and of engagement with the world. He reflected on the day, remembering the faces of the families who would benefit, the laughter shared with volunteers, and the satisfaction of tangible accomplishments. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of alignment between his actions and his values. Over the next few days, he returned to the center whenever he could. Each visit deepened his involvement and commitment. He began to notice patterns, areas that needed improvement, ways to make distribution of resources smoother, ways to reach more families effectively. Ideas he had once dismissed as impossible now felt achievable because he had seen firsthand the impact even small actions could have. The act of helping others had awakened something dormant within him: creativity, problem-solving, and a drive to make a difference. But it wasn't just about work. The connections he made at the center were equally transformative. Conversations with other volunteers revealed stories of struggle, resilience, and hope. He learned to listen, to empathize, and to share without fear of judgment. In turn, he began to open up more about his own challenges. He discovered that vulnerability didn't weaken him. It strengthened him by fostering trust and understanding. These human connections became a lifeline, a network of support that encouraged him to continue moving forward. Even when the work was difficult or emotionally taxing, the impact on his personal life was gradual but noticeable. He returned home with a renewed sense of energy, starting to take care of himself in ways he hadn't before. Meals became more intentional. Exercise returned as a form of release rather than obligation, and he began reaching out to friends he had distanced himself from. The act of helping others had shifted his perspective, reminding him that life was not only about enduring hardship but about engagement, contribution, and connection. One afternoon, as he helped organize a delivery of winter coats for families in need, he paused for a moment. He held a small coat in his hands, imagining the child who would wear it, feeling warmth on a cold day. A profound sense of purpose washed over him. This simple act, once so mundane, felt monumental. It was a tangible reminder that his presence mattered, that his actions could improve someone else's life, and that in doing so, he was reclaiming pieces of himself he had thought lost forever. Even as the storm's aftermath continued to demand attention, he no longer felt overwhelmed. The challenges that once seemed insurmountable now felt like opportunities to learn, grow, and contribute. He realized that purpose wasn't a grand achievement or a title. It was the steady, consistent choice to act in ways that made a difference, no matter how small. Every step he took at the center, every hand he extended, every box he organized, became a thread weaving him back into the fabric of life he had thought he had lost. By the end of the week, the center was in much better shape, and he had become a familiar face among volunteers. Children smiled when they saw him. Mothers greeted him warmly, and the staff welcomed him as part of the team. The feeling of belonging, of being needed, was intoxicating in its simplicity. For months he had been adrift, but now, through the act of helping, he felt anchored again. He understood that purpose wasn't something to be found in isolation. It was discovered in connection, in service, and in stepping forward when others needed support. And so, he continued day by day, task by task, interaction by interaction, slowly rebuilding his sense of self. He no longer feared failure in the same way, because he understood that impact wasn't measured in perfection but in effort and intent. He had stayed behind when others could have walked away, and in doing so he was beginning to find himself again. The path wasn't clear, the future was uncertain, but he had discovered a simple truth. Sometimes, in helping others, we find the very thing we thought we had lost within ourselves. As the days passed, he began to realize that helping others was not always easy. The work at the community center had grown more demanding. Families came with urgent needs. Volunteers arrived at odd hours, and unexpected challenges popped up constantly. Some of the repairs he had helped make were temporary, and the storms continued to create setbacks. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. There were times when he thought about giving up, when he felt the old doubts creeping back, whispering that he wasn't enough, that his efforts didn't matter. One afternoon, he was asked to assist with a family who had recently lost their home in a fire. The couple and their 2 children were overwhelmed with shock, unsure where to turn or what to do next. The parents' faces were pale and drawn, their eyes heavy with worry. The children clung to each other, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it. He introduced himself gently, explaining that he was there to help. He could feel his own nerves rising. What if he said the wrong thing? What if he couldn't help them at all? But he pushed the fear aside, reminding himself that just showing up mattered. He began by helping the family sort through donated items, clothes, blankets, toys. The room was crowded and chaotic, but he moved with care, asking the children about their favorite things, helping the parents find what they needed. The mother's hands shook as she clutched a blanket. The father's jaw was tight with worry, but when he offered to carry boxes to another room, they nodded with relief. In those moments, he realized that helping wasn't always about solving problems completely. It was about presence, about providing support when the world felt too heavy to handle alone. The hours were long and exhaustion settled into his muscles. He wiped sweat from his forehead and took a deep breath, glancing around the room. He noticed that the children were beginning to smile, tentative at first and then with growing confidence. They were discovering small joys in the midst of loss: a stuffed animal, a coloring book, a warm coat. And he realized something profound. These small, seemingly insignificant acts of care were more powerful than any grand gesture. In helping others navigate their pain, he was finding meaning in his own. But it wasn't just the families that challenged him. Some volunteers were frustrated, stressed, or easily irritated. Arguments sometimes broke out over supplies or tasks, and tensions ran high when the pressure mounted. He had to learn patience in a way he never had before. At first, he struggled to stay calm, snapping at someone over a misplaced box or feeling annoyed when others criticized his approach. But then he remembered why he was there. He reminded himself that everyone was under strain, everyone was human, and that empathy was more important than being right. With time, he learned to step back, to listen, and to find compromise. That skill, simple as it seemed, became a lifeline in keeping the center running and in maintaining his own sense of purpose. There were moments that tested him in ways he hadn't expected. One day, a volunteer dismissed his idea for organizing supplies, saying it was too complicated and would take too long. He felt a surge of anger and frustration. The old voice in his head whispered that he should walk away, that he wasn't meant for this work, that he had already failed. He stopped for a moment, clenched his fists, and took a deep breath. Then he reminded himself of the families who relied on this center, the children who smiled when they received something they needed, the parents who could sleep a little easier because someone cared. The choice was clear. He swallowed his pride, offered a compromise, and together they implemented a solution that worked better than either had expected. In that moment, he understood that purpose wasn't about ego. It was about persistence, humility, and dedication. The work also taught him about resilience. He witnessed families who had faced unimaginable hardships yet continued to show strength, patience, and love. He met parents who had lost everything but still smiled for their children. He saw volunteers who were exhausted yet returned day after day to support others. Watching their courage and determination inspired him. It reminded him that life was rarely easy, but even in difficulty, people could find ways to persevere. And if they could, maybe he could too. One morning, he arrived at the center to find a shipment of blankets and warm clothes had been delayed. Families were waiting, shivering in the cold, and tension ran high among volunteers trying to keep things organized. He didn't hesitate. He rolled up his sleeves and began checking inventory, unpacking boxes as soon as they arrived, and directing volunteers to distribute items efficiently. Sweat ran down his back and his hands were sore from lifting, but he felt alive. The gratitude in the family's eyes, the sighs of relief, the smiles that spread across faces made every ache worth it. He realized that purpose was not a feeling that could be forced or found in moments of ease. It was built through effort, through showing up, through being present in moments that mattered to others. The emotional weight of the work was heavy, and some nights he went home drained and quiet. He would sit in his apartment reflecting on the day, replaying moments in his mind, feeling the emotions of those he had helped. Some nights he cried quietly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of suffering he had witnessed, but he never regretted it. Each tear was a reminder of connection, a sign that he was engaged, that he cared, that he mattered in the lives of others. He realized that feeling deeply was not a weakness. It was proof that he was human, that he could still feel and still love and still make a difference. As the weeks passed, he started noticing subtle changes in himself. He became more confident in approaching families, more patient with volunteers, and more organized in managing tasks. His body grew stronger from the physical labor, but more importantly, his spirit felt renewed. He began to wake up with a sense of anticipation rather than dread, eager to see what the day would bring, to help in any way he could. The work had become a part of him, and he realized that staying behind, choosing to act instead of retreating, was giving him something he hadn't had in months, a sense of identity and belonging. There were also moments of joy. He shared laughter with children as they played with donated toys, listened to parents' stories of hope and determination, and celebrated small victories with volunteers when tasks were completed successfully. Those moments, though brief, were powerful reminders of why he had chosen this path. He saw firsthand that purpose could be found not in recognition or reward, but in the simple act of making life better for someone else. Each smile, each thank you, each relieved sigh became a thread connecting him to a larger tapestry of human experience, reminding him that even small actions could have profound impact. At times, he faced internal battles. He doubted whether he was truly making a difference, whether his efforts mattered in the grand scheme of things. But then he would see a child clutching a warm coat, a parent with a renewed sense of hope, or a volunteer smiling in gratitude, and the doubts would fade. He learned to measure success not by perfection, but by the impact of presence, by the consistent choice to help even when it was hard, by the courage to keep going despite uncertainty. The relationships he built at the center became a source of strength. Volunteers shared stories of their own struggles, of times they had felt lost or uncertain. He realized that everyone carried hidden burdens, yet they still chose to show up for others. That realization humbled him and reminded him that purpose was not a destination but a journey, a daily decision to contribute and engage, to care and to serve. In turn, he found himself opening up more, sharing his own story of loss and doubt, finding acceptance and understanding in the shared human experience. One day, as he helped a volunteer organize a delivery of food for a family in need, he paused to watch the children laugh as they carried boxes too large for them, helping in their small ways. He felt a surge of warmth and pride, a sense of connection that words could not capture. It was in these moments, small and ordinary yet extraordinary in their impact, that he realized the truth he had been searching for. Purpose is found in action, in care, in attention to others, and in the courage to stay when it would be easier to leave. By the end of the month, he had become a key presence at the center. Staff and volunteers relied on him, families recognized him, and he began to see himself not as someone adrift but as someone who contributed meaningfully. He had faced challenges, doubts, and moments of exhaustion, yet he had persevered. Each step forward, each act of service had built a foundation he could stand on. He was no longer lost in the shadows of his own mind. He had found light in connection, strength in service, and clarity in purpose. The work was far from finished. The community center still had needs, families still faced hardships, and storms would come again. But he no longer feared the uncertainty. He understood that purpose was not about having all the answers or achieving perfection. It was about showing up, taking action, and making a difference wherever possible. In helping others, he had discovered something essential about himself, that he was capable, valuable, and needed. He walked home one evening, exhausted but fulfilled, feeling the subtle changes in his mind and heart. The path ahead was still unknown, filled with challenges and questions, but for the first time in a long while he felt ready. He had stayed behind when it would have been easier to leave, and in doing so, he had found the courage, the empathy, and the connection that would guide him forward. The journey was ongoing, but the transformation had begun. He had discovered that through service, perseverance, and human connection, he could find purpose again, and it was more profound than he had ever imagined. The days at the community center began to blend together, not because they were the same, but because each one was filled with a rhythm that felt natural to him now. Every morning he arrived early, sometimes before the doors even opened, ready to see what needed to be done. It had become more than volunteering, it was part of his life. The smell of coffee brewing in the small kitchen, the sound of boxes being shuffled, and the gentle chatter of people preparing for the day had become familiar, comforting. He no longer thought of himself as the man who had lost direction. The fog that once clouded his mind was lifting, replaced by a quiet determination that guided him through each day. Yet, even as he grew more confident, he realized that purpose was not a final destination. It was something he had to choose again and again, especially on the days when things didn't go as planned. One morning, he was asked to lead a small team of volunteers. The idea made him nervous at first. For months, he had worked quietly, following directions, never seeing himself as someone who should take charge. But now people trusted him. They looked to him for guidance, for reassurance, and that trust meant something. He accepted the role, reminding himself that leadership didn't mean being perfect, it meant being present, listening, and supporting others. Their task that day was to organize a food drive for families struggling to make ends meet. The community had been hit hard recently, and demand for assistance had grown. As he stood before the group of volunteers, he took a deep breath and began explaining the plan. His voice wavered slightly at first, but as he spoke, confidence began to build. He could see people nodding, listening closely, and following his direction. For someone who had once doubted his worth, this simple moment of being heard felt powerful. The day was hectic. Cars pulled up in a steady line, People unloaded donations, and the team worked tirelessly to sort everything. He moved between groups, offering encouragement, lifting boxes, solving small problems before they became big ones. The work was hard, but there was a shared energy among the volunteers, a sense that they were doing something important together. Even when mistakes happened, no one blamed each other. They laughed, adapted, and kept moving. Later in the afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, a woman approached the center with her 2 children. Her face carried the exhaustion of someone who had been trying to stay strong for too long. She hesitated before speaking, her voice quiet as she asked if there was any food left. He walked her to the back room where they had saved a few boxes for late arrivals. The woman's relief was immediate. She thanked him again and again, tears filling her eyes. He smiled gently and told her it was all right, that she wasn't alone. As she left with her children, he watched them go, his chest heavy with emotion. He knew he couldn't solve every problem or take away every pain, but that moment reminded him that even the smallest gesture could bring light into someone's darkness. It made him realize that helping others didn't just heal the world, it healed parts of him he didn't even know were broken. In the weeks that followed, his responsibilities grew. The center director began trusting him with larger tasks, coordinating schedules, managing supplies, even handling communication with local organizations. There were days when the workload felt overwhelming, but he no longer saw that as a reason to stop. Instead, he saw it as a challenge, something that pushed him to grow. The same man who once doubted if he had anything to offer was now leading others, organizing efforts that impacted dozens of families. It was humbling and empowering all at once, but it wasn't only the work that changed him, it was the people. He had formed deep bonds with other volunteers, each one carrying their own stories of struggle and strength. There was an older man who had lost his wife but found comfort in helping others, a young student who came after school, determined to make a difference despite her own hardships. Each of them reminded him that life wasn't about being untouched by pain. It was about what you did with it afterward. One evening, as they sat outside the center after a long day, sharing sandwiches and laughter, he looked around at the faces of those beside him. He realized they weren't just co-workers or volunteers. They were a community, a family built not by blood but by compassion. The connection between them was real, formed through shared effort, kindness, and the belief that even small acts mattered. Still, there were moments of doubt. There were days when he felt exhausted, when he questioned if he was doing enough, when the weight of the world's problems seemed too big to bear. On one such day, a storm rolled through, echoing the same kind of weather that had damaged the center months ago. The rain fell heavily, flooding parts of the road, and many families called asking for help. He and a few volunteers stayed late, packing supplies and preparing deliveries for those who couldn't make it to the center. As he loaded boxes into the van, soaked to the bone, he thought about how much his life had changed. Months ago, he might have looked at the rain and seen only darkness. Now he saw purpose. He saw a reason to act, a chance to do something that mattered. The exhaustion didn't bother him. It felt earned, meaningful. When they finally finished their deliveries late that night, he looked up at the sky, feeling the rain hit his face, and smiled. The storm no longer frightened him. It reminded him of how far he had come. Over time, his confidence grew stronger. He began sharing his experiences with others, encouraging new volunteers who came in unsure of their abilities. He told them that it was okay to be scared at first, that everyone started somewhere, and that what mattered most was showing up. His words carried weight because they came from lived experience. He wasn't preaching. He was sharing. And people listened. They respected him, not for his position, but for his sincerity. He also began noticing how much the work had changed his perspective on life. He no longer measured success by the things he owned or the titles he held. He saw success in the eyes of a mother who no longer had to worry about feeding her children, in the smile of a volunteer who discovered their own strength, in the laughter that filled the center even on hard days. He understood that happiness wasn't something you chased. It was something you created through connection, through service, through gratitude. One afternoon, a young man came to the center, hesitant and withdrawn. He reminded him of himself months ago, quiet, unsure, lost. The young man said he was looking for a place to volunteer, though he admitted he wasn't sure if he could actually help. Instead of brushing him off, he welcomed him with warmth. You don't have to have everything figured out, he said gently. Just start by being here. The young man smiled faintly and agreed to stay. Over the following weeks, he watched as that same volunteer grew in confidence, learning, connecting, and finding joy in helping others. Seeing that transformation reminded him of his own journey and filled him with quiet pride. He had once believed that losing his way meant failure. Now he understood that sometimes losing yourself was the first step toward discovering something deeper. He had learned to value patience, kindness, and resilience. Life would never be without challenges, but he no longer feared them. He had faced loneliness, uncertainty, and despair, and he had come out stronger, not because he was unbreakable, but because he had learned that even broken things could be repaired with care and purpose. One evening, as the sun set and the center grew quiet, he stood by the doorway, watching the golden light spill across the floor. The place that had once been damaged and broken now stood strong again, rebuilt, renewed, alive. It mirrored his own journey. He smiled to himself, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew this much: he was no longer lost. He had found something that gave his days meaning, something that connected him to others and to himself. Helping people had not only rebuilt the community, it had rebuilt him. As he locked the doors and walked home, the evening air felt calm against his skin. The streets were quiet, the sky a deep shade of orange fading into blue. For the first time in years, he felt content not because everything was perfect, but because he had learned to find purpose in imperfection. Life wasn't about escaping pain. It was about transforming it into compassion, about turning loss into strength, and about showing up when others needed you most. He had stayed behind when others moved on, not because he was stronger or wiser, but because he had finally realized that purpose wasn't something waiting to be found. It was something built, piece by piece, through kindness, connection, and the courage to care. And in that realization, he found peace. The road ahead would bring new challenges, but he was ready. He had rediscovered the part of himself that believed in people, in resilience, in hope, and that belief was enough to carry him forward. Months passed, and the small community center that had once been a place of repair became a place of hope. The walls were brighter, the rooms fuller, and the laughter louder. It was no longer just a building where people came for help. It was where lives were quietly rebuilt, one act of kindness at a time, and he had become part of its heartbeat, steady, patient, and constant. He never imagined himself in this position. In the past, his world had revolved around deadlines, meetings, and a chase for something that always felt just out of reach. Now his days were filled with small, meaningful things: helping an elderly man fill out a form, teaching a child how to plant vegetables in the small garden behind the center, listening to someone who just needed to talk. None of these moments brought fame or recognition, but each one left him with a feeling he couldn't quite describe. Something close to peace. He had found a rhythm again. Mornings started early with coffee and quiet reflection. Sometimes he sat by the window, watching the street wake up, thinking about how life had led him here in such an unexpected way. He didn't have much, but what he did have felt enough. A roof over his head, a place to belong, and a sense of purpose that came not from what he achieved, but from what he gave. One morning, he received a call from the local school. They wanted someone to speak to the students about community work and helping others. When they asked him, his first instinct was to refuse. He wasn't used to public speaking, and the thought made him nervous. But after a moment of hesitation, he agreed. Something inside him told him it was time to share what he had learned, not for praise, but because maybe his story could inspire someone else who felt lost. The day of the talk arrived, and as he stood in front of the group of young faces, his heart pounded. For a brief moment, the old fear returned, that he wasn't good enough, that his story didn't matter. But when he began speaking, the words came naturally. He told them about how he once lost direction, how life felt empty and confusing, and how staying behind to help others changed everything. He spoke about the people he had met, the lessons he had learned, and how giving even a small part of yourself could change someone's world. The room was silent as he spoke, and by the time he finished, a few students came up to thank him. One young boy said he wanted to start volunteering at the center. That simple moment touched him deeply. It reminded him that purpose grows when it's shared, and that his journey wasn't just about him. It was about helping others find their own path too. Over the following weeks, more people came to the center, Drawn by the growing sense of community, some brought donations, others offered time. Slowly, the work expanded. They began organizing workshops, planting a community garden, and even setting up a small reading space for children. He found himself busier than ever, but it was a good kind of busy, the kind that left him tired but fulfilled at the end of each day. One evening, as he was closing up, he noticed the same young boy from the school talk, standing by the door with his mother. The boy was holding a box of books. He smiled shyly and said, "These are for the reading corner." His mother explained that her son had been saving them for months, wanting to give them somewhere they'd be appreciated. The man knelt down and thanked the boy, telling him that what he was doing mattered more than he could imagine. As they left, he felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't just about giving food or supplies anymore. It was about planting seeds of kindness in others. Sometimes at night, when the world grew quiet, he thought about how different his life had become. He remembered the dark days, the empty mornings when he questioned everything. He thought about the moment he chose to stay behind instead of walking away, and how that one choice changed his entire path. Life still wasn't perfect. There were still struggles, moments of doubt, and days when things went wrong. But now he faced them with a steady heart. He had learned that purpose wasn't found in comfort or control. It was found in connection. One afternoon, while sorting supplies, an old friend from his previous life stopped by. It had been years since they last spoke. The friend looked around the center, clearly surprised. "You've changed," he said softly. "You seem different, happier." He smiled and shrugged. "I guess I stopped looking for happiness in all the wrong places." They talked for hours about old times, about where life had taken them. When his friend left, he realized something important. He no longer missed the person he used to be. That version of himself had needed to fall apart so this new one could exist. Sometimes losing yourself was the only way to find what truly mattered. As time went on, the center began organizing community gatherings. They would host small dinners where people shared stories, music, and laughter. At one such event, he looked around the room, at families smiling, at children playing, at volunteers chatting like old friends, and he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He didn't make a speech that night. He didn't need to. Just being there, surrounded by people whose lives had intertwined with his, was enough. He realized that this was what purpose truly meant. Not a grand achievement or a single moment of triumph, but a collection of small, genuine moments that made life meaningful. In the months that followed, he was invited to join a small local committee that focused on expanding community support programs. At first, he hesitated again, worried it would pull him away from the personal touch he loved so much. But he realized that helping on a larger scale didn't mean losing the heart of the work. It just meant reaching more people who needed it. So he agreed, promising himself to never forget the reason he started. He began traveling to nearby towns, sharing ideas, helping others set up similar programs. Everywhere he went, he met people with stories like his. People who had faced loss, uncertainty, or pain, and found healing through helping others. Each story reminded him that he wasn't alone, that humanity was full of quiet strength waiting to be discovered. Even as his world expanded, he never stopped showing up at the center. It remained his home, his foundation. Sometimes he'd still sweep the floors or restock shelves, smiling to himself at how something so simple could feel so right. Years later, people still remembered how it all began, the man who stayed behind when others left. But he never saw himself as a hero or leader. He was just someone who decided not to give up. Someone who learned that when you give without expecting anything in return, life gives back in ways you never imagined. One quiet evening, he sat outside the center, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Children were laughing nearby. Volunteers were chatting as they packed up for the day, and he felt a deep calm settle in his chest. He thought about how far he had come, from a man who once felt empty and directionless to someone whose life was full of meaning. He had learned that purpose doesn't arrive in a moment of clarity. It builds slowly through choices, through kindness, through perseverance. It grows each time you help someone else stand back up. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed in the cool evening air. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, but he was content, truly content, and that feeling was worth more than anything he had chased before. When he finally stood to leave, one of the volunteers called out, "You're heading out early today?" He smiled and replied, "Just taking a moment to appreciate it all." Sometimes we forget how far we've come. The volunteer nodded, understanding. As he walked home, the streets were quiet, the lights flickering softly in the distance. The night air was cool, and he felt a sense of peace that words couldn't describe. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he also knew he would face them the same way he faced everything else, with patience, kindness, and a belief that helping others was the truest form of living. He had stayed behind once, thinking he was just lending a hand. But in staying, he had found something far greater: his purpose, his peace in the understanding that sometimes the way back to yourself begins with helping someone else find their way too. And that was enough.